The wind howled across the endless expanse of frozen tundra, carrying with it the ghosts of storms long past and the bitter promise of a night that would leave its mark on all who dared defy its icy grip. Under a sky the color of bruised twilight, far removed from the warm glow of civilization, an abandoned shack stood as both sanctuary and tomb, a fragile relic of human ambition on the fringes of an indifferent Arctic wilderness. Inside that weathered structure, a small band of hunters turned researchers huddled together against the relentless cold. They had come in search of elusive truths hidden beneath layers of ice and myth. Determined to unravel secrets whispered by native tribes and hinted at in the jagged scars of ancient glaciers. Yet now, with the bitter wind lashing at the walls and the swirling snow mercilessly battering the brittle frame, each heartbeat echoed like a countdown to an inevitable terror. Evelyn, the unspoken leader of the group, pressed her hand to the warped wooden door as if seeking comfort from its familiar creaks. Her keen eyes, glinting with both determination and quiet dread, darted across the dim interior. Shadows danced in irregular patterns on the creaking walls, their movements undulating with the turbulent gusts from beyond. Every breath was visible, a transient mist dissolving into the cold as if the very act of living was a struggle against the elements. Mason, whose voice often broke through the oppressive silence with measured calm, quietly recounted stories of Arctic legends. In hushed tones, he reminded the others of the ancient lore surrounding creatures that stalked these desolate lands, phantom beasts that predated memory, whose spectral forms were said to wander the dark recesses of the forest where even the bravest seldom ventured. Among these fabled horrors, the name Wendigo was spoken with fearful reverence. Though initially dismissed as folklore, the creeping sense of foreboding in the night lent new weight to Mason's words. The group's arrival had been marked by a series of unfortunate events, a series of miscalculations, unforeseen ambushes by the elements, and what they now believed to be an unseen, sinister presence. Their original objective, a scientific expedition meant to document the harsh beauty of the North, had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. Each member of the team harbored his or her own private terror. For some, it was the hope of returning home unscathed. For others, the gnawing suspicion that they had trespassed into a realm where nature ruled by cruel, immutable laws. Carson, the youngest and perhaps the most impressionable of the group, kept a silent vigil by a small, sputtering lantern. He listened to every creak of the shack, every whisper of wind that seeped through the gaps in the timbers. In his mind, the icy gusts carried voices, a mournful chorus of those long lost to the relentless fury of this frozen wilderness. The flickering light threw trembling shadows that merged with the darkness outside, where the storm raged with a purpose that defied understanding. Carson's pulse quickened at every unseen presence, each subtle shift of the wind that might herald another brush with death. Outside, beneath a sky filled with swirling gray, the storm bore down with an unyielding might. The biting cold transformed the landscape into a monochrome wasteland of ice and snow, where the only signs of life were the transient tracks of creatures driven by hunger. It was in those tracks that hints of a double threat began to manifest, cloven prints left behind by massive paws that belonged to the polar bear, and deeper, more sinister impressions that suggested a presence not quite of this world. The very ground seemed to bear the scars of old, untold battles between nature's fiercest predators and forces that transcended mortal understanding. As the wind roared outside, the battered door of the shack shuddered under the force of a heavy, unseen presence. A moment of trembling silence followed, a pause loaded with tension so thick it felt as though the very air had become a silent witness to the impending doom. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she recalled the sounds of scraping and shuffling during the past nights. Moments when enormous claws tapped insistently against the wood, as if testing the barriers meant to keep them safe. It was not just the brute force of a wild animal she feared, it was also the mindless hunger that roamed the ice, a hunger that was soon to be magnified by an even darker presence. In that grim space between certainty and dread, the group's conversations dwindled to anxious whispers. Each word carried the weight of unspoken fears. Their shared history, stories of previous expeditions and half-remembered tales from local folklore, gave rise to a collective understanding that they were being watched. The rustle of snow outside, once a gentle serenade of nature's cycle, had morphed into a haunting drumbeat signaling the approach of something unnatural. It was as if the storm itself conspired with darker forces, merging the fury of the elements with the cold purpose of death incarnate. Evelyn remembered the first time she had encountered the marks of their watchers, a scratch on the door. Subtle at first, but unmistakably deliberate, it was a reminder that the wilderness was not empty. It was inhabited by hunters just as ruthless as those who now stood inside the shack. But these intruders were not men. Their intentions could only be interpreted as predatory instincts, driven by a primordial hunger that spared no mercy. The notion that a polar bear might be lurking beyond the flimsy barrier sent shivers racing down her spine. For she knew too well the power and savagery a starving beast could unleash. Yet even as the polar bear's presence loomed large in her mind, a more insidious thought began to take form. In the hushed murmur of the wind, in the soft rustling of the snow against the shack's exterior, there was something else, a hint of malevolence that could not be explained by nature alone. The legend of the Wendigo, a creature said to embody the insatiable hunger of winter itself, edged its way into the conversation with an unwelcome persistence. The mere notion of such a being, half human, half shadow, cursed with a predatory instinct that defied all natural law, was enough to chill the blood and blur the line between myth and reality. As twilight deepened into an inky abyss, the interior of the shack became a crucible of fear and determination. The wind's relentless assault was punctuated by intermittent, ominous thumps that resonated through the fragile walls. Each thunderous knock, whether the product of fate or misfortune, heightened the urgency of their plight. The group had abandoned any hopes of solace in the modern world. They existed now only in the moment, clinging desperately to the remnants of courage that remained in the face of an enemy that was both primal and inexplicable. In the scattered glow of the few remaining lanterns, faces were etched with exhaustion and steely resolve. They recounted memories of former lives, a time when laughter was shared over hot drinks and the warmth of human connection was more than just a distant memory. Now, those recollections seemed as fragile as the ice beneath their feet. The realization that every second brought them closer to an encounter they could neither predict nor control was as palpable as the frost that crept along the edges of their meager provisions. And so, with the storm's crescendo reaching a fever pitch, the first whispers of dread found their voice. Through the windows, battered by sheets of cutting sleet, the group caught fleeting glimpses of the land beyond, a realm where shadows merged with the biting cold and monstrous shapes moved with a predatory grace. In those moments, it was impossible to tell where nature's cruelty ended and the supernatural began. The boundary was blurred, leaving the hunters suspended in an eerie limbo between rationality and fear. As the night deepened, so too did the sense of impending calamity. Every creak of the settling shack, every gust of wind carrying frozen debris, seemed to foreshadow the approaching horror. The palpable tension in the cramped space mirrored the chaotic patterns of the tempest outside, a conflict of elemental forces clashing in a silent dance of destruction. Within this fortress of battered wood and feeble hope, the line between man and beast, science and myth, began to dissolve, promising that the coming hours would test the very limits of human endurance. The atmosphere inside was heavy with anticipation. Through the cracks in the frosted glass and behind the fragile planks of the door, the hunters could sense movement outside, a slow, deliberate motion that hinted at a presence stalking the perimeter of their refuge. It was as if the wilderness itself had drawn breath, poised for the impending confrontation. In that quiet moment of awareness, a somber truth settled over them. Survival in this frozen abyss would demand more than courage. It would require them to confront the raw, untamed forces of nature and the legendary monsters that haunted its dark corners. Unbeknownst to them, the forces at play were already aligning for a confrontation that would upend everything they knew about the balance between predator and prey. Somewhere within the vast expanse of ice and shadow, the hungry eyes of a polar bear scanned the horizon, its powerful body barely visible against the blizzard's fury. At the same time, something darker stirred beneath the forest canopy, a whisper of ancient hunger and unfathomable malice that had been waiting for a moment of weakness. For the slightest lapse in vigilance, the night wore on, punctuated by long intervals of oppressive silence, during which the relentless wind and the intermittent scratching at the door bore witness to the inescapable truth. The Arctic was not a sanctuary for the weary, but a battleground for forces both natural and supernatural. In that crucible of cold and fear, the hunters' shared destiny began to intertwine with the savage rhythms of the wild. The storm was more than a meteorological event. It was an omen, a herald of a coming clash that would force man to face the raw fury of the beast and the dark myth that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. For now, they waited in the dim light of their fragile refuge, hearts pounding in unison with the relentless drum of the storm, unaware that the forces gathering just beyond the threshold would soon breach the boundary between terror and survival. In the blending of roaring winds and whispered legends, the first faint stirrings of a confrontation took shape, a battle neither the hunters, nor the land, nor even the ancient myths could have ever foreseen. Even as the storm raged with a fury that defied mortal comprehension, an almost imperceptible shift in the very fabric of the night betrayed that the fragile barriers keeping danger at bay were about to shatter. The relentless wind had transformed the Arctic into a theater of chaos, a place where nature and nightmare converged in the endless darkness. Within the cramped confines of the old shack, the hunters clutched their meager belongings and each other, their collective breath mingling with the pounding beat of a fear that grew with every passing moment. It began with a sound, a deep, guttural roar that resonated from beyond the battered door. The immense force of the moment sent shivers through the walls, and for an instant, time itself seemed to pause. Evelyn's heart thundered as she gripped the splintered wood, trying to decipher whether it was the roar of a starving beast or something far older, something ancient and cursed. Across the room, Mason's eyes darted toward the fragile window panes as if seeking confirmation of his worst fears. The wind's wail momentarily drowned out all thoughts, leaving only the raw, primal urgency of survival. Outside, beyond the feeble fortification of their shelter, the maelstrom of snow and ice revealed a surreal interplay of light and shadow. In the midst of the white chaos emerged a massive shape, a polar bear. Its matted fur a tableau of nature's brutality. The animal moved with both the grace of a seasoned predator and the despair of a creature driven to desperation by hunger. Its eyes, glacial and unyielding, fixed on the small haven the humans had constructed. With each step, the ground trembled beneath its vast, powerful paws, the crashing echoes a grim serenade to the inevitability of the night's cruel design. Almost at the same moment, from the fringes of a dark cluster of towering, wind-battered pines, a different horror slithered into view. Half hidden in the obsidian shadows, the Wendigo emerged like a specter of primal terror. Its gaunt, elongated limbs and emaciated frame were draped in ragged remnants of what could once be human, yet now twisted by an unspeakable curse into something wholly unrecognizable. The creature's eyes glowed with an otherworldly luminescence, a burning ember of madness and hunger, and its ragged breath misted in the cold air as it advanced with deliberate malice. In that charged moment, the natural order was violently upended. The polar bear's thunderous roar mingled with the unearthly, ragged cry of the Wendigo. The two entities, driven by their own ravenous instincts, converged upon the shack and the vulnerable humans it sheltered. It was not merely a battle for territory, it was a collision of forces, each as relentless and merciless as the Arctic storm itself. Inside the decrepit shelter, panic flared like wildfire. Carson, the timid but intuitive youngest member of the group, bolted upright as the door shuddered once more under the onslaught of crushing pressure. His wide eyes, illuminated by the sputtering lantern, mirrored the terror that no words could fully capture. In whispered urgency, Evelyn motioned for silence and swift preparation, her voice steady despite the quiver of dread in each syllable. The group huddled close, their hearts pounding in erratic rhythm in unison, a score to the unfolding tragedy. The first assault came suddenly. The cacophony of shattered wood and breaking glass heralded the polar bear's desperate attempt to force its way in. The creature's immense bulk crashed against the door, splintering it with an unrestrained display of raw strength. At the same time, over the howling wind came the low, near-hissing growl of the Wendigo. Its form, barely visible in the swirling darkness, moved like a living shadow, leaving behind a trail of freezing malice. It appeared to glide rather than walk, each movement calculated to instill terror in the hearts of its prey. Caught between a monstrous force of nature and a spectral abomination, the hunters faced the unthinkable. Evelyn's mind raced as she sought an escape route or any means of defense. Mason, though stricken with his own dread, struggled to quell the rising panic with words of encouragement, urging them to remain calm so that reason might guide them through the chaos. Yet even as he spoke, the sounds of frenzied battle outside grew louder, a terrible symphony of snarls, shrieks, and the crashing cacophony of colliding beasts. The polar bear, its massive frame fueled by both hunger and rage, surged through the broken doorway. Its claws tore at the air and the splintered timbers. And in that moment, every instinct in the human body screamed to flee. But before the hunters could scatter to the safety of the darkness outside, fate intervened in an almost surreal twist. As the polar bear lunged, the Wendigo moved with an inhuman speed, its elongated limbs stretching out to intercept the charge. The two collided in an explosion of violence, a collision of muscle and myth that rocked the very foundation of the night. For a long, agonizing minute, time was absorbed by the struggle. The polar bear's savage snarl vibrated through the air, while the Wendigo's unearthly cries echoed with a dissonant song of despair. In the midst of this ghastly melee, the hunters were forced into an agonizing choice: attempt a coordinated escape or remain trapped in the center of a maelstrom that threatened to consume them all. The violent clash between beast and nightmare was not a spectacle meant to entertain or awe. It was a desperate contest of survival in which collateral casualties were inevitable. In the chaos that ensued, flashes of surreal terror and acutely human vulnerability intermingled. Mason, with trembling hands, unsheathed a rusted hunting knife, a feeble weapon against the colossal fury raging outside, while Evelyn frantically marshaled any scraps of resolve within her to push them toward the only possible salvation: escape. The shouts and muffled gasps of their companions filled the dim space, each echo a grim reminder that the world outside was now teeming with merciless fury. Amid the tumult, a plan began to crystallize, with the bear and the Wendigo locked in a frenzy of mutual combat. A small window of opportunity emerged like the brief glimpse of a thaw in the icy grip of winter. Evelyn, her voice resolute despite the primal terror, urged the group to gather what little provisions they could carry and to make a break for the small trail that led toward the relative safety of a distant rocky outcrop. "Now's our chance," she hissed through the roar of the storm, her eyes locking with those of Mason and Carson. "We must move before the whole area becomes our grave." The chaos outside provided both distraction and uncertainty. Between the monstrous clashing of unnatural forces, the hunters slipped from the shack, their movements a desperate dance along the narrow precipice of life and death. With every step crunching on the brittle, frozen ground, every gust of icy wind threatening to rob them of precious equilibrium, they ventured into a world that was rapidly morphing into an alien landscape, a place where the boundary between myth and reality blurred into obscurity. In the slippery terrain, the group encountered moments of both quiet agony and fierce, burning resolve. Shadows of the battling beasts loomed large against the snowy backdrop, their titanic struggle casting a macabre glow across the horizon. The polar bear, engaged in its savage tug-of-war with the supernatural Wendigo, was thrown into a display of primal strength and fury that defied all human understanding. Its roars were punctuated by guttural snarls and the crunching of ice as its massive paws churned up the pristine snow. Opposite it, the Wendigo's disfigured form contorted with every lurch and strike, its twisted limbs reaching out like the grasping fingers of death. As the hunters moved further away from the now collapsing sanctuary of their refuge, the Arctic's endless cold pressed in around them. The sky overhead, once a muted canvas of despair, now sparkled with the occasional drift of starlight, fleeting reminders of a beauty that was forever tainted by the night's horrors. Yet even within that meager light, the silhouettes of their pursuers were unmistakable. One of the hunters, a grizzled man whose eyes spoke of battles fought against nature and fate alike, stumbled near a mound of jagged ice. His cry, swallowed by the tumultuous wind, was lost to the void. In that moment, the ferocity of the polar bear and the relentless determination of the Wendigo underscored a grim truth: in these frozen lands, no soul could escape the grasp of the wild without sacrifice. Between the monstrous roars and the clattering of shattered ice, nature itself seemed to breathe a bitter lament for the lost and the damned. The hunters pressed onward, driven by instincts inherited from a lineage that had known little but the struggle for survival. Every footfall was a silent prayer. Every icy gust a reminder of nature's indifference to human plight. The collective heartbeats of the group synchronously pounded out a somber rhythm of hope and resignation. Knowing that the outcome of this night would be etched into the annals of their fragile existence long after the storm had passed. And then, amid the cacophony of the titanic clash, a sudden, thunderous impact shook the very ground beneath their feet, a collision so violent that it reverberated through the frozen earth. The Wendigo and the polar bear, locked in a deadly embrace, were flung apart by a surge of uncontrolled energy. In that fleeting interval, as the mighty beasts staggered and regained their balance, the hunters found themselves caught in a moment of paradoxical clarity. The chaos of the night had momentarily birthed an opening, a narrow corridor between life and oblivion. Evelyn seized the precious seconds with a fierce determination born of both terror and hope. Rallying her companions with a hushed command, she led them through the swirling veil of snow and blood, each step laced with the gravity of survival. Mason and Carson followed, their faces etched with determination and grim understanding. Behind them, the sounds of animalistic howls and the haunting, otherworldly cries mingled with the din of the storm, composing a dirge that celebrated the unyielding brutality of this desolate wilderness. In the midst of their hasty retreat, a fleeting glance back revealed the surreal tableau of the battlefield. The polar bear, its once mighty form now visibly marred by the savage encounter, staggered as it attempted to rise. Blood, dark and glistening against its white fur, mingled with the melting snow in a grotesque pattern. The Wendigo, ethereal and tormented, writhed on the ice as if burdened by the weight of its own cursed existence. For a moment, the monstrous adversaries, one a force of primal nature, the other an embodiment of ancient terror, paused in their deadly struggle, as if recognizing the futility of their rivalry when measured against the raw indifference of the frozen expanse. The juxtaposition was as haunting as it was ironic. Here were two predators, each driven by an insatiable hunger, locked in combat for dominion over a realm that offered nothing but despair and unrelenting cold. In this fragile interstice, the hunters, though battered by both physical and emotional exhaustion, grasped the essence of their predicament. They were not merely fleeing a single threat but escaping an orchestrated collision between the natural and the supernatural. A convergence that had rendered their once familiar world unrecognizable and hostile. Driven by a mix of adrenaline and the unyielding will to live, the group pressed forward into the uncertain dark of the Arctic night. Every step was a battle against the relentless wind and the ever-present fear that the darkness might conceal one more horror. In the fleeting brightness of scattered polar lights overhead, they saw the outlines of jagged rocks and crevices, landmarks that promised either refuge or further peril. None of them knew what awaited beyond the next ridge or round the next bend. Only that remaining in the area meant certain doom. As they scrambled over icy mounds and evaded pockets of treacherous, hidden crevices, the hunters found themselves united by a fragile bond, one that was forged not in comfort or camaraderie, but in the shared desperation of confronting the unfathomable. Each whispered prayer and every exchanged glance carried the weight of survival, echoing the silent understanding that their lives hung in the balance. What had begun as a scientific expedition was now a battle not only for survival, but for the reclamation of hope in the face of nature's cruelest adversaries. In that endless Arctic night, amidst the shifting dance of snow and shadow, every heartbeat was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And yet, as the sounds of strife and the echo of titanic roars receded into the distance behind them, an ominous presence continued to linger. It was as though the very night had absorbed the remnants of the brutal conflict, preserving the macabre memory in an eternal cycle of suffering and chance. The hunters, battered by the ordeal and marked by the vision of ferocious beasts dueling under the tyranny of the storm, could only look ahead into the uncertain promise of a new dawn that might reveal scars too deep to heal and questions that would forever haunt them. For in the frozen wastes of the Arctic, where legends breathe among the howling winds and each moment teeters on the brink of oblivion, the struggle for survival is a cruel game. And though they had managed to escape the immediate embrace of the night's monstrous duel, the memories of that savage spectacle would forever be etched into their souls, a grim reminder that in the realm of ice and myth, alliances are never truly won, and every victory is paid for in the currency of fear, loss, and the unyielding march of time. The bitter twilight ebbed into the cold blush of pre-dawn as the survivors pressed onward through a world unmade by storm and myth. The shattered remains of the shelter lay buried beneath the layers of ice and snow, testimony to a night when nature and nightmare battled with unrestrained fury. In the wake of that grotesque duel between the polar bear and the cursed Wendigo, the group's escape had become a desperate pilgrimage through a landscape that seemed intent on erasing all traces of human hope. For hours they trudged across treacherous expanses of ice, their footprints fading almost as quickly as hope did in the face of the endless white. The wind, which had been a relentless fury in the night, now whispered secrets among the frozen plains, half murmuring like the sigh of a wounded giant. Each step seemed measured in loss and a dawning understanding of the cost of survival. Every shard of drifting ice a reminder of the blurred line between nature's impartial cruelty and the malevolence of ancient legends. In the stillness after the carnage, the group, haunted by the echoes of clashing beasts and the final anguished cries of their own mortified hearts, found themselves alone with the memories of what had transpired. As the first fragile light of dawn broke through the ever-threatening haze, Evelyn, ever the steadfast leader, guided her companions over a narrow ridge that overlooked a vast valley. In that moment, the sight of the valley, with its skeletal remains of wind-bent trees and jagged outcrops of ancient rock, presented a haunting panorama of life's persistence amid ruin. The hunter's eyes, red from exhaustion and the sting of freezing winds, were drawn not only to the external landscape but also deep within themselves. Each knew that the course of that bloody, storm-wrought night was forever etched into their souls, a covenant written in ice and blood. The once ferocious howls that had rent the fabric of the storm had dwindled to an eerie silence, broken only by the lapping of cold wind against bitter stone and the soft crunch of their deliberate footsteps on frost-hardened ground. In the distance, the tumult of battle had faded to a muted, spectral memory, yet over the horizon, as if emerging from the very heart of the abyss, a sliver of amber light glimmered, a sign of civilization. Or perhaps just another beacon in the endless Arctic night. With hearts laden with equal parts relief and trepidation, the survivors set their course for that solitary promise of warmth and respite. The journey that followed was no less perilous than the horrors of the night. With the wreckage of their former refuge left behind, the group wound their way through a labyrinth of ice canyons and snowbound ridges. The landscape transformed with the subtle artistry of the early sun, shadows deepened into a mosaic of black and gray, while patches of blue emerged where the ice thinned beneath the brutal clarity of day. There were moments when the silence was so complete it seemed to press upon them, each member of the group lost in their own private struggle against memories of blood and the savage glint in a creature's eye. Carson, who had been so visibly fragile during the terror of the night, walked with a quiet determination born of newfound maturity. He could not rid his mind of the image of that gaping maw and the unreal glow of the Wendigo's eyes. Yet he found comfort in the unspoken bond that had been forged in shared terror. In his silent vigilance, he took solace in the natural order of survival, a lesson thrust upon them with the indiscriminate cruelty of nature. The irony of their flight was not lost on him. They had scarcely escaped the conflagration of two monstrous forces only to face an unforgiving wilderness where every gust of wind seemed to murmur of that ancient, insatiable hunger. Evelyn's steady command had kept their spirits tethered even when every instinct urged them to surrender to despair. Now, as they crossed a barren expanse where the ice shimmered like a field of broken mirrors reflecting their fractured dreams, she found herself contemplating the true nature of the forces they had encountered. The polar bear, a mere animal driven to madness by starvation, and the Wendigo, a living embodiment of myth and curses, had both been cast into an arena where survival was dictated by the harsh logic of the frozen world. In that thought, she recognized a perverse symmetry. Nature, however cruel, was unyielding in its balance, a balance that human pride could never hope to master. The path grew steeper as they scaled a ridge that overlooked the distant lights of a small coastal settlement. The sight of the town stirred feelings of hope, yet it also carried a bittersweet reminder of how far removed they were from the warmth and safety of a once familiar life. Each step toward the settlement was laden with the memory of every fallen moment, a balance between the fierce roar of the polar bear's challenge and the ghostly lament of the Wendigo. And although the remnants of their monstrous adversaries lay scattered in the valley below, the scars of that night were still raw. The land itself bore the testimony, splatters of dark, congealed blood on ice, shattered fragments of wood and bone that had once belonged to ambitions and creatures alike. At length, as the Arctic winds softened into a reluctant murmur, the ragged group arrived at the outer fringes of the settlement, a modest cluster of wooden buildings, warmed by the glow of hearths and alive with the quiet hum of human determination. Welcomed them like a long-forgotten dream. There, in the tender embrace of those flickering flames and murmurs of routine, the survivors could finally begin to shed the weight of the night's horrors. Yet even as they sought shelter and began to recount the surreal events, the clash of animalistic might and ancient malevolence, their words trembled with a lingering uncertainty. For each tale was a stark reminder that the boundary between myth and reality had been obliterated in that frozen battleground. The townspeople listened in disbelief and awe as the survivors recounted their journey, from the relentless siege of the old shack, to the savage collision of the polar bear and the Wendigo, and finally, to the arduous escape across the merciless ice. Their collective narrative wove together fragments of shattered hope and hard-won wisdom, painting a picture of a wilderness where even legends were bound by the inexorable laws of nature. With every recounting, the survivors slowly understood that their ordeal was not simply a fight against external monsters, but a journey into the darkest recesses of human vulnerability, a testament to the strength and frailty that coexisted in every living soul. In the quiet of the settlement's modest inn, with the dying embers of the hearth casting dancing shadows on tired faces, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of introspection. The events of that night had altered the very core of who they were. The ferocity of the polar bear, a creature driven by raw physical need, and the insidious allure of the Wendigo, a manifestation of forbidden hunger and mythic decay, had forced her to confront a paradox. Sometimes the most fearsome adversaries emerge not from without, but from the depths of human isolation and despair. The Arctic, in all its indifferent magnificence, had become both an arena of survival and a mirror reflecting the fragility of hope. As the dawn turned to day, the survivors began the slow process of healing, both of their wounds and of their battered spirit. They worked together to rebuild a semblance of order amid the lingering chaos, gathering remnants of their shattered past and attempting to piece together a future defined not by what they had lost, but by the resilient spark that still burned within. The memory of that final confrontation remained etched in every whispered conversation, every vigilant glance over their shoulders. Yet even as they embraced the comforting normalcy of human connection, an unspoken acknowledgement persisted that the enigmatic wilds of the north would forever harbor the ghosts of that night. In quiet moments, when the wind would howl over the icy expanse and the memory of ferocious roars would echo faintly in the distance, they could almost hear the reverberations of the monstrous struggle. And in those echoes, a timeless truth was revealed: the natural world, with all its brutal beauty and ancient mysteries, was an ever-turning wheel of life and death, a force that allowed no one, not even the bravest, to remain untouched by its relentless passage. As the survivors finally found refuge in the safety of the town's humble embrace, the true cost of that fateful night began to unveil itself. A toll measured not only in blood and frostbite, but in the shattering of old certainties about humanity's place in the cosmos. The lingering horror of the Wendigo's unholy visage and the polar bear's raw, primal fury blended into an indelible reminder that nature's wild heartbeat could not be silenced by human intervention. Instead, it pulsed on, a ceaseless chant in the frozen wastes, reminding all who dared traverse its domain that survival was a bond forged in adversity, a bond that occasionally pitted man against myth and left scars too profound for time to forget. In the final hours of that long and harrowing night, as the Arctic sun rose in a pale, reluctant dawn, Evelyn and her companions gathered together one last time. There, amid the quiet lull of a recovering settlement, they vowed silently to honor the memory of both the fallen and the monstrous forces that had sought to claim them. Their story, woven with threads of terror and triumph, would be passed down as both a warning and a reminder that in the realm of ice and shadow Legends are never far from reality. And sometimes an unwilling alliance with fate is the only way to emerge from the darkness.